Are we on? We are on. Hello there. Welcome to Agree or Disagree, the podcast, Hockey Edition. My name is Kevin Olenek. You can follow me, of course, on Twitter at KEBOLE. You can subscribe to all podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Add me and a friend on Facebook, Kevin Olenek. And we hope you're it's been a couple of weeks. We hope you're doing well. And as we are in the second half of the summer, school in September is starting soon. And I hope you can bear with me a little bit here. This is the first time that I'm using a new laptop to record, as my original laptop has been stolen. So I've been using one that's a little bit different than what I'm used to. So I hope we sound okay. I think it sounds like we sound okay. Heidi, are we sounding okay?
I think we're sounding okay, and I hope that I sound okay, because I am such a professional podcaster that I somehow lost the cord that goes between my mic and the computer. So I'm on a different mic today.
Oh, so the doohickey is not in the do-a-thing, and yes.
Yes, technology has failed both of us.
Yes. Well, I don't even know if it's technology has failed me. I think it's humanity failed me. But anyway, that's a whole other subject. Sean Holmes-Smith, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. Okay, so I understood that there was some kind of late drinking stuff. Was there? Or?
Our mutual friend Ryan is the head brewer at local brewery Tool Shed, and they launched a new beer, the Protest Pale Ale, that was brewed by their associate brewer, as well as they invited anyone who identified as LGBTQ to take part in the brewing process. And they launched it last night at a pub doing a drag show. So last night was fun.
That was very interesting. Very interesting. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Today we are going to, there's not really much going on in the world of hockey right now. We're kind of in a bit of a dead tailspin here. It's like the dog days of the off season here. We're waiting for restricted free agents to be signed. We're waiting for some UFAs to be signed. We're waiting for some trades. We're kind of in the middle of kind of the dead here. But one of the things that I do think is becoming very interesting, and it's really becoming interesting in all sports, is the topic of analytics. How's it being used? Is it something that can be used very accurately, inaccurately? Is it overrated? Is it underrated? All of that sort of stuff. We've talked a little bit on this podcast about analytics and what we feel about it from some sense, but we do have a guest that actually specializes in it. He writes for the Hockey Graphs, the Athletic TO, and the Athletic Chicago. He's a bi-weekly contributor to the TSN Analytics. He's also an analyst for hire, and he's with us from the fine city of Ottawa, Ontario. He is Sean Tierney. Sean, how are you today?
Doing well. Like you said, it's kind of the dog days of the hockey summer, so sometimes, spending time hanging around Twitter can be a bit of a slog when you have all this time to argue and no news to really debate much about, but doing well and trying to keep myself busy while we look forward to the next season.
Yes. Well, as Canucks followers and Canucks fans, there's always something to argue about. So, you just go on Canucks Twitter, they're arguing about something. That's the most entertaining there. But I kind of wanted to start with kind of your perspective of how you got into analytics. What was the fascinating thing about it for you? How did you get started, and kind of tell us your story.
I think the maybe sort of shortish version of the story for me, I've always been a big hockey fan, always a hockey watcher, and my father was too. And he owned a hockey card shop, and so I was sort of, forced free labor for many years, sorting through hockey cards. And when you spend a lot of time around that sort of thing, you kind of get into the stats and points and the penalty minutes and all that sort of thing. And so that the numbers part of the game was always something that interested me a lot, that really resonated. But as an adult or as coming into hockey in the wake of the analytics movement, I was really just interested that there was this sort of wave of numbers that weren't on a hockey card from way back when that seemed to be really important and offered some different insights into how players contributed. So, when you talk about things like WAR, when you talk about things like Corsi and all those sorts of stats that have become part of the common language, for me, it was just sort of that natural bridge to get into that, to say, there's stats are obviously important in the sport. We've got these new stats that are out there, and which ones are good and which ones are bad. So I think most modernly, the thing that got me really into analytics, my origin story, is a piece I wrote about David Booth years and years and years ago now. The Leafs had just signed David Booth, and it seemed like maybe it was a good move, and there was some debate on Twitter, and I thought, I want to go and look for some numbers to have an original angle on this to say whether or not the move will be good. And once I got going in that direction, it just kind of fed off of itself once I realized, how much there is out there to be had, and not all of it's great. And part of the responsibility of being involved in the stats community is learning how to wade through which stats matter and which ones don't.
Okay. So from your perspective, what matters and what doesn't?
Yeah. So that's a really, it's a great question, and it's a huge question. And so there's a range of things that matter a little to a lot. One of the sort of popular summer arguments when we don't have hockey news is WAR, which is popular in baseball and versions of it in basketball now as well. Is that something that works in hockey when you reduce a player to a single number that kind of captures all of their achievements? And I think it is, as long as it's understood what it's trying to tell you. We know that things like Corsi for percentage or shot share, we know that predicts future goal scoring really well. So that's really important. We want to score more goals. We also know certain places where we have a lot of question marks still. Data around goalies is still not as advanced as we are with some other positions, where it's kind of tricky to say which goalies are really performing well and which ones aren't. And so it's a sliding scale for sure, from things that matter not at all because they don't really tell us about the future, to things that are really, really good at predicting the future, like shot share and a variety of others.
With WAR, it's such a complicated and complex stat that I think that's what turns off a lot of the people and makes it harder for them to understand and really get into trying to figure out what that stat means. And there's also, I believe there's also like multiple models of how WAR is calculated depending on what stat site you go to these days. When you calculate WAR, what stats are you using to help create that number?
So the best producers, and like you said, there's a couple different sites that calculate WAR maybe just slightly differently, and not in a way where you get, Erik Karlsson is the best defenseman in the league, Erik Karlsson is the worst, but where you get, shades of difference maybe from one player based on the model. For me, the one that I prefer to use, the one that I use most, is one by Evolving Wild on Twitter. Their website is evolvinghockey.com. The stats that go into it, like you said, I think sometimes it can be a bit of a turnoff for fans when you see, the high level of math that might be required to try to isolate, especially because hockey is such an fast-paced sport with, 12 skaters or including goalies out on the ice, and you have a lot of sort of interaction. It doesn't work quite like baseball where you get those isolated individual sort of actions. And so for WAR, the things that wind up going into it or the work behind it, you can read about it, but the best way to understand it is you try to isolate the player from their line mates. You try to take context into consideration. So if you get to skate with Connor McDavid all year long, but you're Alex Chiasson, we don't give you too much credit, for some of the things you did, knowing that McDavid was super impactful. So we're able to say, here's what a player contributed overall at even strength. Here's what they did on the power play and shorthanded. Here's their penalty differential impact. And you come up with, that sort of one number in the end that gives you that value for the player. But I think something that's really important for anybody that feels kind of turned off by the math right off the bat is to say that nobody would tell you that this WAR score is where you should stop talking about a player. You get this number down to the second decimal place, and that's the end of the discussion. The idea is more that you can say, Connor McDavid was clearly better than whatever player you want to pick. And we're pretty sure about it because there's a big difference in their WAR scores. But if you say Connor McDavid was better than Mark Stone last year, well, their WAR scores are very similar overall. And so we wouldn't say with a lot of confidence he was definitely better. And I think as long as you're speaking that language to someone who maybe isn't an immediate buy-in for WAR, it's easier to have those discussions and say, this isn't the Bible, this isn't the end of the discussion with a player. It's a starting point to say, here's the overall contributions. Now let's drill down a little bit and see what's underneath the hood for that player.
Go ahead, Sean. Or Heidi, or...
And, okay, and then with the WAR stat, I think part of the big argument that I struggle with is the word replacement player, the term replacement player, and how that, as you said, as you've done a good job at explaining, because there's 6 skaters per side, and there's no isolated one-on-one sort of battles because everyone's working together and everyone's playing different roles. I find that's my roadblock is the definition of a replacement player, because I think in my mind that someone who plays a third line checking role or a set versus someone who's more offensive, they bring different things to the table, and you're not going to replace a third line checking center with, say, a Nikolai Goldobin, right? So that's one thing that stops me from really being able to fully grasp the WAR stat. Is there a definition of a replacement player that you can share?
Yeah, definitely. So again, drawing from Evolving Wild, and it goes all the way back to Bill James, who did some of the sort of seminal work on this in baseball. The idea of a replacement level player that we're using as the benchmark is the best way to picture it is the next player you could call up from your farm team. And so the replacement player isn't necessarily your third liner at all. It's more like, what's the next player up that you could put into your roster for free without having to go make a trade to get some other player. And so what you find is something like maybe 75 to maybe as high as 80% of the league is above replacement level. And then you get that sort of slice of players that are underneath that. The reason that replacement level is kind of the benchmark is interesting in a way. One other way to do it, in a way we commonly do things, is to compare somebody to average and to say this player is above average or below average. But you get into exactly the problem you were just describing, where you might say, your third line checker provided a below average or average WAR score, but average is actually really valuable, and it can be difficult to acquire an average player. You're talking about a league with 800 skaters in it over a given season. And so WAR aims at that replacement level as the benchmark because you set it much lower, down to the level of how much value did this player provide above the next guy you might have called up from your farm team. And by setting that benchmark, you can still say that your third line player, because they prevented goals against, because they kept the puck moving in the right direction when they were on the ice, they were valuable more than the next person you could have replaced them with without any cost to your team. So I think that part's really key, and I'm not sure if that sways you or helps to kind of get around some of your fears with it, but for me, that kind of conceptual understanding is helpful to think. We're not talking about an average player, because those guys are worth, a lot in a league as
as big as the NHL. We're talking about a replacement player, the next player up from the AHL level, basically.
So using using the Chiasson example, like if he was regular, so this is where I'm a little confused. So if he was regularly on Connor McDavid's line, and then like you're kind of I'm a little confused. That's like your Chiasson example is confusing to me. So I'm just trying to clarify what I'm hearing in my head. So Chiasson would, in a lot of people's eyes, would be considered a third line player. I understand that, but if he's regularly playing with McDavid, does his if he's replaced with someone else, does that come into factor? Or I'm a little confused there.
Right, and so it's a really great question, and I think one thing that's interesting with hockey is I think as fans, it's easy for us to overestimate how much time players spend with their line mates over the course of a season. It tends to be a lot less, especially over 82 games than we think. So, Chiasson had that run where he had some first-line time with McDavid. That didn't last all season long. And so what you get is minutes where these two players were together, and you can see what his rate of production was then. And then you can compare it with how McDavid performed when he wasn't with him and how Chiasson performed away from McDavid. And that's how you get that sort of sense of saying, wait a minute, when we adjust for the line mates that this player played with, when we look at their context, how were they with these players? How did they play away from them? Then you can kind of start to isolate their individual impact. But even knowing that part, it's still a big issue with trying to sort out a sport as interconnected as hockey, because you still have all these minutes where these players were together, and it can be difficult to untangle. So, for Connor McDavid last year, his wins above replacement was about 4 WAR or so, which was one of the top WARs in the league. But Chiasson winds up being right around about 1 WAR, a little bit less than 1 WAR. And that's because we can say there's lots of time where these two players were with each other, but also lots of time where they were away from each other. We can isolate those impacts and say, this is what Chiasson was doing when he wasn't with McDavid. It wasn't great. This is what McDavid was doing when he wasn't with Chiasson. It was the same stuff McDavid does no matter what, plugger you put on his line with him. And it's not perfect, but you can get that sense where you pull these two apart of what their contributions were with and away from each other.
Right. Okay, that makes sense to me. It could be because
sorry, just to chip one last thought in, hopefully that part makes sense. But you still do run into problems, and it's really important, to be really clear about this kind of thing. One of the paradoxes is the Sedin problem, which should resonate in Vancouver, where Henrik and Daniel Sedin played with each other so much for so long, and in a situation as extreme as that, it does become a little bit tricky to say, was one of them driving this more than the other? Were they equal? Was one really the one doing everything and the other one wasn't? Because they were so attached. But, it's a real extreme to get twins that play together for so long like they did. For the most part, you're able to get lots of time where players are with each other, but also away from each other.
Right. Yeah, I get that. But also the Sedins are they're a bit of you mentioned not only they're twins, but they just were so unique. We've never really seen anything, and probably never will see anything like that again, just with the uniqueness of how they play together.
Yeah, exactly. And not just the synergy that they obviously had too, which was something we'll likely never see again, but just the fact that they stayed with each other on ice so much that it becomes, you have such a small sample of time where they were away from each other that you really can't say, well, Henrik was clearly the one leading that pairing. We just don't have enough data to say that convincingly.
Right.
But that, as long as you know that when you're talking to Worstat, you can say, well, we're not totally sure there, and you can move on with the analysis, just knowing that you're not overstating how certain we can really be.
Right. I felt like I interrupted someone. Did I interrupt anyone?
Yep. Yeah, and with continuing on with that thought process, is there sort of like a benchmark time on ice, like sample size that you kind of look at for when you're trying to separate these plays out from each other, to say that we have enough information, enough data to say that this person is driving this line?
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't take as a baseline any player that's got less than 200 minutes at even strength. You just kind of leave out of the analysis because there's too much room for that player's play to have fluctuated. It's not enough time to really suss out what was luck and what was talent. So, I do a lot of visualizations. I make a lot of graphs on Twitter for anyone that follows me there. And anything that I produce by the end of the season, I leave anybody with less than 200 minutes off the charts. And that's just because we don't have enough information on them to say reliably, this is probably what this player is. Once you get across that 200-minute kind of fair minimum, then it's a little bit fair game to start looking at things like their Corsi bore percentage and that sort of thing. But I think the best way to answer it in terms of WAR is that you get the slide scale. If you've got players that are above about 1,000 minutes or 1,100 minutes or so, that's usually something like 60-ish games of regular play for a top 6 kind of player. You can be really sure that you're getting a good sample. If you're at 500 minutes or 400 minutes for a player, then all that you do when you look at a WAR score for that player is say, this is what we got in 400 minutes, but we're not quite as certain about this because we haven't seen lots and lots of sample enough to be confident. So rather than setting one number and saying some players are in and some players are out, it's more just adjusting how sure we feel about the player's score based on how many minutes we have for them.
So I guess in terms of the rookies that are coming in, like the Hughes and the Kakos and the Byrams, what's kind of your, in terms of your analytics on that, what are you measuring there?
Right, and when you talk about players, recent draftees, players that were playing outside of the NHL, it really is difficult for a number of reasons. One is we're just really fortunate with the NHL to have the wealth of data and the wealth of analysts making stats for this league so that we can evaluate it. And you just don't have that if you go league by league. Even if you go to the KHL, which is kind of the next highest level up, you can't get quite the same sort of data. And so for me, one way that I like to try to get around it, there's a Manuel Perry on Twitter. He's Manny Elk. He was the founder of Corsica, which is a great hockey stat site that's out there, sort of one of the bedrocks of the stats community. And he does some work by taking the data that he can get from all the different leagues. And then over time, you can get equivalencies where you say, this league is stronger than this league based on the scoring over time. And when you have those kinds of adjustments, you can say, okay, a point in the NHL is kind of the gold standard. If you scored 1 point in the KHL, that's like 0.75 points in the NHL. And you can make these adjustments based on how the league's strengths have looked over time. So then to get to your question about somebody like, a Quinn Hughes stepping into the lineup, we're looking at his data from outside the NHL as a young player, as a prospect. We can adjust for the strength of his league, and then you can kind of make a projection forward based on players like he is to say, if he was scoring at this rate, playing at these many minutes in the minor or in the as a prospect, this is what we project forward. But again, it's the kind of thing where you're saying, this is a good projection based on some good data for what we have, but it's really uncertain until we start to get some NHL sample for that player. It's a projection with lots and lots of room for error until we see, how they sink or swim once you get them on NHL ice night in and night out.
So the one that is, I think, I don't want to say is a confusing one, but the stat around you mentioned Corsic, but Corsi. Can you explain that to the ones that don't quite understand that yet? And how is it, because the worst stat in hockey is the plus-minus stat. I think that has been generally been one that has been panned over time because there's so many factors in that. But how is Corsi kind of replaced or improved on the plus minus?
So plus minus, the big flaw, if you were going to sum it up really quickly, is that you're taking only goals to come up with a number for a player, and especially a number that might not have had much to do at all with what the player did. So, goals are very rare in a sport like hockey. You see maybe 5 or 6 goals total in each game, which is really, really, sort of low when you compare to other sports like basketball or football, or baseball, which have, much more scoring in them. And so, you hop over the boards on a line change. You chase a 2-on-1 down the ice, and the team scores, and you got a -1. And I don't think anybody feels comfortable saying that really reflects on that player's ability, to prevent goals when they're on the ice. And so, that kind of idea is what started to undermine plus minus as useful. It also rewards everybody on the ice the exact same way. So you can be standing 200 feet away from a goal that's scored, and you're treated just the same as everybody else. And I think, just watching cognitively when we see that, it feels weird to say that. And it doesn't seem, like we're really capturing the spirit of what we want to do. So the reason that Corsi has come into vogue Corsi is any shots that are directed at the net at all, even if they're blocked by your team. You look at all the shots your team throws towards the net when you're on the ice. You compare it to all the shots taken against you when you're on the ice, and you get a percentage. And so players that are over 50% are players that more often are getting the puck at the opposing goalie rather than having the puck come their way. What turns out with Corsi or CF percentage, Corsi for percentage, is knowing somebody's Corsi percentage is a better predictor of future goal scoring than knowing their actual goals. And that's because goals are they have a lot of random to them. They don't happen very often, and lots of things can influence whether a puck actually goes in or not. But players have a lot of ability or some good ability to get the puck going the right way. It might not go in, but they can get the puck at the right end of the ice and prevent it from going, the wrong way. And so the reason CF percentage, Corsi for percentage is taken over is that it's a better future predictor of success. If you want to know which team is going to win more often in the future, it's the team that has that puck possession, Corsi for percentage, above 50%, not necessarily the team that scored more goals than they've given up so far. One is a better predictor than the other.
Okay. So it's sort of it's some ways it's hypothetical, but
sorry to cut you off.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. This is your wheelhouse. You talk.
I get excited going at this sort of thing. Right. So I wouldn't say hypothetical. I would say it's more like goals are easy to see. They make highlight reels and they get replayed a few times on air, and you might see them, but it's easy to miss sometimes the way a player is contributing to controlling the flow of the play. And so you could have a Quinn Hughes type, for example, good with the puck on his stick, clears the D zone easily, make sure the puck is kept in at the blue line on offense, gets the puck towards the net. It turns out that players like that routinely control the flow of shots in a game, those are the players that get better results, and those are the teams that win more often than the teams that just happen to have goals go in the end, because goals are rare. It wouldn't be quite the same in something like basketball where you get 100 points for a team. You can look at the points a little bit more because there's so many, the sample is big. But in hockey, it's just so much less that we're better off looking at something that has a lot of sample, like shots. And the players that are good at making sure shots are going on the opposing goalie and not at their own goalie, we know that over time, those players make up teams that tend to win more often. It's not perfect. And again, we're always talking about how confident can you be in a stat. We're much more confident knowing about a player's puck possession, their CF percentage, knowing that result will follow through, than we are just strictly by knowing whether or not they got scored on that night or not.
Okay. Sean, Heidi, did you have anything to ask?
I do have stuff to ask. So my thing with just kind of stats in general is that sometimes I can find them a little bit intimidating. I understand their importance. I come from like a marketing, social media type background, so like I understand them that way. But so like I said, and I understand the importance that way. But I guess like maybe like my question is, what would you say to somebody who, like me, like knows that all these stats exist and can get into arguments with their friends, and as soon as their friends start pulling out stats and numbers and things, it just kind of seems kind of lost. So what's sort of your maybe advice on something like that situation?
It's a great question, and I feel really passionate about questions like that. I think stats can be intimidating it's not just a small segment of people. I think stats are intimidating, to most people. And if math wasn't your favorite thing, or if math isn't something that, you just enjoy doing in your spare time, I think if you look at a giant spreadsheet full of numbers, it's not something that's going to, gather your interest or make you feel welcome the way watching a hockey game might. And so for me, I'm not coming from a strict math background either. So what I've really focused my attention on over the past few years is working on graphs that I make for hockey stats to sort of condense things into pictures, to make it easier to kind of get started with advanced stats without it seeming, quite as intimidating as it could be for someone like yourself or for, lots of fans. And so for me, I use Tableau, and I make a variety of different graphs that I update daily. And, I take the stats that we know are important, and you can make, sort of quadrants and scatter plots and say the teams that are up here are good, and the teams that are down here, they're playing bad. The teams that are up here, they're lucky. The ones over here, they're unlucky. And keeping, using those stats, but presenting it with a visual like that and with sort of clear descriptors saying this stat's important, and this is how it looks in a picture. I find that visual sometimes can be enough for someone to say, okay, that sort of aligns with what I was thinking anyway. It's not as intimidating maybe I thought, and maybe it provides that bridge or access point for someone to say, okay, maybe I'll go digging through a few more of these stats and see how it aligns with what I already think about players and teams. And then maybe, over time, it's the kind of thing you become more comfortable with. But I think something like the visuals and charts that I really focus on, those sorts of things can be that tool for people to say, a wall of numbers on a spreadsheet. I don't think anybody's really, super excited to stare at those for hours. So maybe this can be the bridge to get people into that conversation.
Okay. No, that makes total sense to me. I totally, that whole, like, the visual learning thing and stuff as well. Like, I'm right now, I'm on my other screen, I'm looking at your, at the roster projections right now, and just seeing how that's all laid out.
Right, and that's something I spent a lot of time with this summer, because we're in a sort of phase where you have time to tinker around with things. And if you're looking at the roster projection, I hope it's something that there's lots going on too. But the idea is you can see JT Miller, first line left wing, and he's got a blue logo, and blue means good. And you can see Tanner Pearson projected to be second line left wing. That can change, of course, going into the season. But he's red, and red is bad. And so it means we expect below average contributions from him if that's the role that he plays in. And so for me, I'm really sort of passionate about the idea of looking at a picture like this and being able to get a takeaway really quickly, and without having to, read 10 articles and become a math major. And then if this is something that motivates someone to say, okay, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about what went into it, you can check something that I've written, or you can go read something in another blog, and maybe it becomes that sort of gradual process of diving into the world. Or maybe it's just enough just to look at it and say, yeah, I kind of figured JT Miller was going to be a big addition. I'm not surprised to hear Tanner Pearson's probably going to be a bit of a slog if he's a second line left winger. And that's enough for me, and I can move on knowing somebody who's put a lot of time into trying to present this in an easy to understand way.
Right.
Cool.
It helps with projections, and it'll like and I think it will help it helps give some perspective to arguments and give some perspective to what is going on. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one thing I'm always really cautious to do, and anytime I'm talking about this sort of thing, is to say, this doesn't sum up everything in the entire world. This is a great place to start a conversation and ask more questions about why. Why is Tanner Pearson projected to be a subpar second line left winger? Do we know some things about that? Can I go somewhere next to find out a little bit, more about that? And as long as you're sort of facilitating that conversation without saying, this is the end of the discussion, my graph is right, and you're wrong if you disagree. I think as long as you're fostering that sense of discussion, it makes it easy for people to get involved and say, oh, okay, I can see the strengths of using these numbers. I can also see the limitations. And now I know what I'm watching for when I watch the next game, to see is that actually happening? Is Tanner Pearson as bad as Sean Tierney kept claiming he would be?
Is there someone that has surprised you in a good way with analytics and someone that has kind of shocked you with analytics?
Well, every season we run into interesting situations where, players with really sexy, fancy stats kind of, get a lot of publicity for the work that they do, and they're not necessarily household names. One that kept coming up for years and years before he disappeared to the KHL was Cody Franzen. And he's kind of a beautiful example in a way. I'm not sure if it's a player that any of you have had a lot of eyes on. But he's this funny thing where he wasn't impressive looking in how he played the game. He wasn't a great skater. He was kind of a sloggy skater when he was on the ice. He didn't always have that gritty teeth intensity look like a Milan Lucic or whatever. He kind of looked sometimes like he was just plodding along, not a great skater. What's he really up to? But the advanced stats kept showing that when he was on the ice, the puck was moving in the right direction more often than not. He was a very positive player. And so he kind of became a point of contention, especially for the Leafs, where sort of a more old school eyes on this player said, he can't make it in this league. He doesn't have the skating. He doesn't have the whatever, the grit, the intensity. And the stats underneath, kept saying this is a player that really positively contributes and is worth, a long look. Not the whole NHL is ready for that kind of thing yet, but he was kind of a real interesting case for a couple of years like that. I think maybe one case in the opposite direction, which might hit home again for Canucks fans in particular, is Tyler Myers. He sort of strikes maybe in the other direction, where he's a big, tall player who's put up some points in the past. He's got that hockey player look, and I think by the eye test sometimes he looks, like the kind of player you ink to a long-term deal in free agency. But year after year, if you look under the hood, it turns out that he's kind of pinned in his end. He's not great at exiting the zone with control. Tends to kind of give up a lot of shots when he's on the ice, regardless of who his partner is. And so, he's kind of an interesting case where the Canucks have made a long-term investment in him, but the underlying numbers suggest that he's not a positively impactful player. And so, looking into next year for the Canucks, I'm really interested to see how his play translates when you move him out of the Winnipeg Jets, who struggled to control shot share last year, and move him to the Canucks, which is a team that's kind of all of a sudden shifted into go for the playoffs again mode. Does he still look like that kind of player that struggles to control the puck, or do things change for him at this point in his career?
Sean, what are your thoughts?
It's Tyler Myers is definitely one of the contentions that I've had, because I think there's, as we've discussed before, the interconnectedness of hockey and all that, and I think he strikes me as a player who I think with the right partner could be a very good sort of second pair defenseman who can help produce offense, but he's not going to be someone that you're going to want to have anchoring a second pair line, a second pair. So it makes a lot of sense to try and look into that and see that he's not necessarily a play driver. But I think that's one thing that a lot of fans who just sort of look at that WAR stat and don't understand that it's more of a jumping off point more than an actual. This is the type of player. This is a good player. This is a bad player. Is that sometimes players who complement and find that chemistry really can really jumpstart their careers again. Like we look at, I think one of the best examples of that would be Anson Carter. Like he would the one season he played with the Sedins, he lit it up, and then he goes away and can't do anything. And then it took a couple seasons for the Canucks to find the right winger for the Sedins for the next when they finally settled on Burrows. So I think there is some sort of chemistry that I don't quite think is being encapsulated in that WAR stat, but like you said, and I think you've done a really good job at saying it, is that it's more of a jumping off point, and you have to look at some other stats, and you have to look at and watch them play to really get a better idea on what type of player you're getting with a Tyler Myers specifically.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I like to think of anytime I'm sort of defending how stats can be useful, especially to somebody who's either an opponent or someone who has never really considered it, is like you're saying, you want to be able to watch Tyler Myers, and you want to be able to say, well, I can see why things went so poorly for him in Winnipeg. Look who he was dragging around as his partner last year. Look at the context of his play. He was deployed in the defensive zone to start his shift all the time and all that sort of thing. WAR does take some of that into context, but the way I like to think about it is whenever I'm watching hockey, I can usually watch an early game and a late game. I'm in the Eastern time zone, so usually you're watching a Leafs or Habs or Sens game, and then you get a late game, whatever the Western Canada team is on Hockey Night in Canada. And so, if I really put my mind to it, I can watch 2 games faithfully in a night. If I get up to go get a bag of chips or a glass of water and come back, I miss a couple minutes here and a couple minutes there. And, I sort of make my analysis of this player based on what I've seen. The beauty of something like, looking at all the shots, like that Corsi for percentage, or a WAR stat is these stats watched every game without ever leaving. They watched every game for every player all season long. And so it's not biased in the same way that I'm biased when I watch. So every time I watch Connor McDavid, I think, this is great because I keep seeing him do this whenever I happen to be watching. But I want to know what happened when I wasn't watching, too, when I left the room, when I missed the game because I was at a party that night. And the reason we like stats is that they're not biased in that way. They see everything, even the stuff we can't see. So it's really like the analytics are just a collection of all the eye tests without ever blinking. But it's not a separate thing disconnected from watching the game. It's just like watching every single game all the time.
So how does hockey differentiate himself from other sports in terms of analytics? I was talking to a buddy of mine who follows NFL, and he felt that the NFL, it's better analytic-wise for team stats, and it's more individual stats. What are your thoughts on how hockey is using analytics in terms of team versus individual?
Yeah, I think the NFL has really embraced the analytics movement, including having tracking data where they actually have, sort of motion-based data on players. And baseball with StatCast has this too. And so that makes, it creates this gigantic flow of stats to be processed. And because of it, sports like the football and baseball, the NFL and MLB, have been adopters of analytics for both individuals and teams. They've hired lots and lots of analysts. They're generally open to this sort of thing, to have a stats department, because so much information is available that I think you just couldn't afford to ignore it and be left behind by that wave of information. Hockey isn't in the same spot yet. And so we know there's a few teams that don't really employ much of a stats department at all. The Senators have a couple of sort of adjunct stats people. The Blues didn't have anybody in particular, let alone a department last year. Anaheim is famously without a stats department too, all the way up to something like the Leafs, who employ, as many as 10 people in a really advanced stats environment. And so the NHL is still in that kind of developing early phase of bringing stats to the forefront. We know that tracking data is going to happen next year. It's not clear what extent of it will be available publicly, but teams are going to start to get this flow of information. So my idea, my projection is the NHL is it won't be possible to stay out of the stats arm race for long. Teams are going to need data engineers and developers to handle all this information, or else they'll get left behind in the Stone Age really quickly. So the NHL isn't there at the same level as other sports yet, but they won't be able to avoid it for long, especially as this tracking data takes over for individuals next year.
Yeah, because there's something. Yeah, I was in an NFL preseason game. There's someone that was literally dressed in a GPS, some sort of GPS outfit that can track the speed of a receiver now, which is crazy to me. That it's in some ways it's crazy, and in some ways it's just kind of fascinating that's happened already. It's interesting to me, sort of in terms of that.
Right, and you can see, what route did the wide receiver run, or what cut did the running back make when you have that kind of data. And then you get into this world of, okay, which parts of these things matter? Does it matter if, your wide receiver is 1 mile an hour faster than some other wide receiver? Is that a meaningful stat that turns into more touchdowns over a season or not? And if you don't have, sort of a department of people digging through that and figuring it out, it would be really easy to say, oh yeah, we want the fastest players we can find. But then it turns out it's a Cody Franson problem where speed isn't the only thing that really matters for a wide receiver or whatever. So it'll be interesting to see how teams grapple with all this new data as it comes in, trying to suss out which things are actually important and matter and which things don't.
Yeah. Sean and Heidi, I'm feeling like I'm hogging the conversation.
No, you're not. I guess I'm just listening. Like, I'm learning so much by just listening to this, for sure. Just one thing that was kind of like now in my brain now that you even have started talking about other sports is I've talked to people before that I feel, for lack of better term, are just being grumpy old traditionalist men, and think that all this like you said, like the tracking lines and the more importance on the stats and the data and stuff is kind of taking away from the meaning and the fun and the entertainment and all that stuff of the sport in general. Do you have any kind of commentary on that at all?
Yeah, so I'd say two things to that. One is, whenever you say the sort of grumpy old man, I hope my father doesn't wind up listening to this podcast, but he kind of stands in as that person for me when you describe it that way. And for me, over time with him, if I'm watching, a game with him, if he comes over to watch a Leafs game, for example, he knows that this is something I've become interested in and something that I, know some things about here or there. And so every once in a while I toss a tidbit out, like, something about zone exits. Like, this player is one of the best in the league at getting across the blue line with possession. And sometimes for him, he's like, okay, well then who's really bad at it? And you can kind of give a couple names or talk about why it's important. And I think, if you're willing to play the slow game over time, even an old grumpy man like, my own father can be, kind of brought in over time. And I know he likes to go and then trot out some of these stats with, his crew of old grumpy men friends and, be the smart one or whatever. So I think a part of it is just maybe controlling exposure. Some people really like just kind of the mystique of watching a game and not worrying too much about anything other than the final score. And I'm not here to judge anybody's fandom at all. If that's the way somebody loves the game, I say have at it. And if somebody's interested in understanding a little bit more what's going on, like, you know, I have been or whatever, then there's lots of ways you can sort of slowly bring somebody into that. But you can't force somebody to care about something that just doesn't resonate. And, you know, for many fans from older generations where this data wasn't available, it's not a thing for them. And I don't think they should be forced into it. But one thing I would offer, I guess as an aside here, there's an infographic that goes around about hockey sometimes that I really love. And it shows inputs, outputs, and then results. And in the input section, it talks or it lists the things that go into making hockey players good. So you have heart, you have speed, you have grit, you have leadership. All those sorts of things are inputs. And then when you put all those inputs in with a player, you get these outputs like generates a lot of shots, gets out of the zone with control, works well with lots of different line mates, the things that we can actually measure with some numbers. And then you get the results at the end, scores more goals than the other team. And so when you're watching a game, you say, yeah, I don't really care for these new stats. This guy plays with a lot of heart, and that's why I like him. It's not like heart is taken out of the stats. In fact, it's the sort of bedrock of it or the base of it. A player with a lot of heart, if that matters, then we expect that it means it's going to turn into something we can measure, like more goals or more puck on their stick. And then in the end, we should expect to see more goals out of them. And so it's all in there still. It's just a matter of separating what we actually can measure, like goals and shots, from the things we can't, like the size of a guy's heart. So I guess those are the two ways I try to approach people like my father who are from a different generation. And then in the end, you know, if that doesn't sway him, then I back off and let him yell at the screen a little bit more.
Yeah, it's all about language. I've found is if you can find a way to explain, because Corsi is not a descriptive term. So if you can, as it is, it's shot share and in a sort of a broader sense, it's who's controlling the puck more. Then you can start bringing people who are a little more against the stats into it, because and it's really just what's the always take a shot. Is it just get the puck on net and you never know what will happen, right? And that's an old adage that most quote unquote grumpy old men can get behind. So I think it's all about language and how you approach it, and I think that's something that we've seen sort of the pioneers of the stats revolution and all that sort of they got their hackles up a lot and weren't willing to find the right language, and then you had this just divide that grew between the old just watch and yell and if the guy laid out to block a shot or put his body online no matter what, they became a fan favorite, versus now where those players aren't necessarily becoming as much fan favorites with the newer younger crowds, because we are more educated on what they actually bring. So again, it's just all about language, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. And as a day job, I'm a teacher, as my primary job. And I always think, just like you're saying, the way you present something is key, and choosing the right language or the wrong language can be the difference between someone getting there and someone not getting there. And then the other thing I remind myself every day, too, is, in a classroom, I'm looking at 30 students in a day, and not everybody's going to move a step forward every single day. So, my job is to present the things I should each day, and development happens at different times for different people. You get a boom sometimes where a few days in a row someone's on fire, they're really getting it. And sometimes, you go through a week where someone's just kind of checked out and they're going to get back to you later. And I think maybe that kind of a thinking works in the hockey or in the stat sphere in general too, where, if if good stuff is out there over time and it's not presented in a threatening way, you never know when someone's going to finally say, oh, actually, I do like that. I always did yell, get the puck on net. And that's really what shot share actually is. Okay, I can kind of see it. And it might not happen today because they're not ready yet, but it might happen in the future. And so the job is just to stay, positive and welcoming to people that are just coming into the stats community, and just, hope that someday something clicks and somebody likes it. But you can't control when that might be for somebody.
Yeah, it does take time, and I think what I'm hearing you say is the reality is the analytics and the stats are kind of proving the eye test in a lot of ways. What you're seeing is what you're seeing. And one of the great debates in Calgary, Heidi might remember this, was the value of Chris Russell, because Chris Russell used to block a lot of shots. And that was something that a lot of people really liked. But when you dug into what Chris Russell really did, the question was how effective he was. So that's kind of, and I remember that there was a huge argument on one radio station about his value. One felt like, I look at the eye test of Chris Russell and he's really valuable. And it's like, well, you look into his numbers, he's actually not as valuable as you're seeing. So, but it is kind of adapting and adjusting to that, I think.
Yeah, and Chris Russell was a really hilarious or interesting and polarizing case of the eye test versus the stats. I still remember reading the article where they referred to him having rodeo stock as part of the reason he was such a great player out on the ice, and it still kind of kills me, think of it. Chris Russell is interesting because you watch him and you say, wow, this guy, what a defensive player. He's blocking a lot of shots, and I know that that's good because it means it didn't get to the goalie and it couldn't be a goal. And then what the advanced stats revolution has allowed us to do is say, okay, yes, he's blocking a lot of shots, but how does that play out for players that are always blocking shots? Well, what does it mean? It means he doesn't have the puck ever. The other team always has the puck in his end shooting at him, and he's blocking it. And so which player winds up being more useful? Russell player who's willing to lay out no matter what to block shots, or somebody like a John Klingberg from Dallas who doesn't lay out to block shots, but he's also in the offensive end shooting at the other goalie, all the time. And which of these leads to better goal results in the end? And we know that in the end, the Klingberg is better than the Russell or players like that. And so it's still not ignoring the eye test. It's just saying, okay, I know what I can see. Does it matter? Does it really matter when we play it out over time? And then, making your judgments from there.
Right. Is there a stat that hockey is not tracking as well that you would like to see them track?
Definitely. So one gap that we have is being covered single-handedly by Corey Schneider. He's at Shutdown Line on Twitter, and he covers zone exits, breakups at the blue line, zone entries, and passing. And we don't have any data on that sort of thing in the play-by-play data from the NHL right now because it's not something that they track with the official scorers. And so, unbelievably, there's one person out there right now, this Corey Schneider, who goes through and watches as many games as he can in a season, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games, and hand tracks all his data. It's just mind-blowing to think of the work that he's done over the past few seasons, and, he's just this sort of singularly focused person who's out there doing it. And so he provides as much sample as he can on which players provide passes that lead to shots for their teammates. So you think of the Ryan Johanssons and Joe Thorntons of the world, people who are constantly setting up others to get their shots, but that don't get credited for it in an assist or in a goal in the end. But we know that those passes leading to open shots are important, and Corey's doing everything he can to track it. But until we get chips in the pucks so that we can try to measure this in some other way, it's really difficult to get a lot of it. The zone exits and zone entries is another, where right now we're kind of relying on the single-handed efforts of this one person, and we just need more data there to start to figure out which of those stats matter and which of those stats are real player talents and which ones aren't.
Do you guys have anything else you want to ask?
I think we've covered a lot of really good subjects and topics today.
Awesome.
Yeah, no, I don't think I have anything else to ask. I think I'm going to spend time now after I get off this call and read some stuff. And
yeah, it's been great. It's really been very informative, and I can hear your passion about this as well. So tell us, Sean, how can we follow you? How can we support you? What are you up to? And kind of what you're going to be doing as we get prepared for training camp.
Sure. So I'm at Charting Hockey on Twitter, which is the best place to find me. I make charts throughout the season, some daily things that I update every morning, and then some sort of bigger things that I do, like the roster projections that I'll do all the way up to the beginning of the season. So you can follow me on Twitter, and that links to all the different charts that I make. I'm going to be launching a website in October as well, where it'll be sort of a one-stop shop for all the things that I do. And I do have a Patreon that's linked through my bio on Twitter as well. And lots of people have been kind enough to chip in a couple bucks per month to keep me caffeinated as I make all these charts. And it's a way people can support me if they're interested to do so as well.
Cool. Well, I'm really glad that we were able to take your time, some of your time this afternoon and this evening to kind of talk to us through a little bit of analytics here. I feel like we're in a base level. I think as the season goes on, I'd like to, of course, talk to you more and just kind of, get a sense of what we're gauging and what we're seeing, if it's true or not. So, and I think there are going to be a lot of in Calgary. There's going to be a lot of people that will be fascinated about that, and I think there'll be some Canuck fans and a lot of hockey fans as well. So really, thank you very much for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Would love to hop on again during the season if you want to chat again. So thanks for having me on.
Awesome. And Heidi, how do we follow you?
you can follow me at Heidi Amazeballs, HEID Amazeballs on Twitter and Instagram and all the fun social media places.
And Sean?
I am BeardyCanuck03 on Twitter.
And of course, you can follow me at KEVOLE. We will be back next week. There might be some news. Who knows? Maybe a restricted free agent will sign. Who knows? We'll talk about that next week. Until then, we'll talk to you all soon. Bye for now.